Whether you know it as the Chunnel, the Eurotunnel, or the Channel Tunnel, this iconic feat of engineering is a hugely important link for the UK and France, connecting Calais and France to Folkestone in the UK. It's the UK's only connection to continental Europe, and they were actually considering building a very long bridge, but ultimately felt that a tunnel would be the best bet and less disruptive, which is why we now have the Channel Tunnel and not the Channel Bridge. The tunnel itself is below the seabed, 75 meters below sea level at the deepest point, and it takes just 35 minutes to get across. But did you know that the tunnel was proposed all the way back in 1856, or that Winston Churchill was a huge advocate for such a tunnel all the way back in 1924 when he was trying to get other people on board with the idea? In this video, we're going to uncover some fascinating facts about the Channel Tunnel and teach you some things you never knew you needed to know. So let's do a brief rundown of how it all came about. The first person to ever propose the tunnel was actually a French engineer named Albert. In 1902, he was like, guys, I have this great idea. We should definitely build a tunnel, and we should use horse-drawn coaches and oil lamps, and also build an artificial island halfway across because we're gonna need to change the horses out. No one really took him up on this bright idea, but the tunnel gets proposed again in 1856, as I mentioned. It gets proposed again in 1865, and then in 1866, a man named Henry actually checked out the floor of the Strait of Dover, which is the body of water that the tunnel now goes under, and he proved it was made of chalk, which meant that the idea of a tunnel was actually feasible. But still, no luck in making it happen. Exploratory work starts taking place in the late 1800s, and both the French and the British began tunneling through the chalk. However, this ended in 1883 because the British got cold feet and were worried that it could be used as a means of invasion. Again, through the 1900s, Winston Churchill was a big fan of the idea, but nothing came of it. Then in the 1950s, finally, both the British and French governments agreed to actually properly start surveying the geology of the area and figuring out if this was something they really wanted to do. Now you'll notice that obviously the French and British had to work closely together to make this happen. It's a real combination of culture, economies, and languages to get it all worked out. And before we get to the part of the story where they actually figure out a plan, I thought it might be interesting to point out that all of the signs within the tunnel and on either side are in both English and French, obviously. And while I have always needed the English translation, I can finally read the French signs first and understand them when we're coming onto the French roads after we exit the tunnel. And why can I do this? If you haven't heard, it's because I've been using Lingoda to learn French for the past 3 months, and I've been practicing by being able to read and say French road signs. Tunnel sous la Manche, the Channel Tunnel. Arrête, stop. Rappel, reminder, speed limit. Péage, toll. Lingoda has been a great way for me to learn French. They also offer other languages like Spanish, German, and Italian, but the most important part is how I can tailor the entire online language learning experience to suit me. I've gone with the Flex option, which lets me book classes more easily around my schedule because I'm not always available at the same time, but there's also Lingoda Teams if you prefer structure, as well as the Sprint option if you want a challenge. Learning to speak and understand French in small classes with actual human teachers on the other side of the camera is giving me a lot more confidence than I've ever had in French, and the self-study materials let me keep learning. If you're interested in trying Lingoda with me, click my link and use my discount code in the description below to save £15 on most courses when signing up. Okay, so in 1964, the two countries actually agreed to a real plan for a tunnel, but the Labour Party governing in 1975 canceled it due to uncertainty about a general economic crisis at the time. The Conservatives then come to power in 1979, and while the government was not interested in funding the project themselves, they did agree to a privately funded project. By 1985, multiple schemes and proposals were put forward. In 1986, the Treaty of Canterbury was signed by the French President and British Prime Minister at the time, who was Margaret Thatcher. It's called the Treaty of Canterbury because it was signed in Canterbury Cathedral. This treaty drew a land frontier between the two countries in the middle of the tunnel, and it was an agreement for the construction of the tunnel by privately owned companies. The actual tunneling began in 1988, and the French and the English side met in the middle in December of 1990, with construction finally completed in 1993. The very first ride was on the 6th of May, 1994, when Queen Elizabeth II and the French president took rides on separate trains that met in the middle of the tunnel. And so it exists today, with 3 tunnels. 2 tunnels carry Eurotunnel freight and passenger vehicle trains called Le Shuttle, as well as Eurostar train services, and there's a smaller service tunnel through the middle. Now, a quick note if you're not actually from the UK or haven't used the tunnel before, the Eurostar train is the direct train from London to Paris, so obviously this needs to use the tunnel, but you can also drive your car onto the trains carrying vehicles on Le Shuttle, as well as motorcycles, buses, camper vans, things like that. So you drive onto it on one side and then drive off on the other side. I have done both journeys, and it's pretty cool when you're on Le Shuttle, as you're allowed to get out of your car and stretch, go to the bathroom, whatever, so you can see a bit more of the inside of this train that carries vehicles across. Now let's talk about some fascinating facts about the Channel Tunnel, or at least I think they're fascinating, and you haven't clicked off this video yet, so clearly you do too. Did you know the British tunnelers had to choose an item to pass through to their French counterparts when the two sides met? So of course they chose a Paddington Bear toy, because the Brits love themselves some Paddington Bear, that's just a fact. Also, over 10,000 people were involved in the construction of the tunnel, and the total length is over 50 kilometers. Le Shuttle carries around 10 million passengers per year, and the Eurostar trains carry around 11 million. Also, get this, the freight shuttles and trains that use the Channel Tunnel carry a solid 25% of the value of trade between both countries. Now, after they excavated all of the chalk during construction, they had to actually do something with it, so they used it to expand the British Isles, and they created this country park, which is 2 miles west of Dover. Also, the tunnel boring machines, boring as in boring into the earth, not boring you to put you to sleep, were given very technical names by the English, but the names used by the French were actual names like Europa, Brigitte, and Catherine. And the English did have one on display at one point on the side of the M20, but then it got sold for scrap metal. However, you can still see one of the machines on the French side in the middle of a roundabout. The tunnel does operate in profit, and it gives people another option between flying or ferries to get between the two countries, though construction costs were high, and overall it cost about 4.6 billion. And our final fun fact, yes, the Channel Tunnel actually does leak. It was designed this way. The water comes through very slowly and is collected at drainage sites along the tunnel, and they pump it away. And sadly, for my friends who have never ridden through it and are perhaps imagining they can look out the windows to see the sea creatures like you're in some sort of drive-through aquarium, that would be very cool, but for your own safety, you're underneath the seabed in a highly reinforced concrete tunnel, so the views are a 0 out of 10 and you will not be Finding Nemo. I hate to be the one to break it to you. Now it's your turn to let me know in the comments below, have you been through the Channel Tunnel, any facts of your own to share, or maybe you worked on it or knew someone who did. I love to hear your story, so definitely leave those below. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.